Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your host Sam Foote.
And Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Office 365 focused IT security professionals. Each week we talk about a specific topic in the space. This week it's episode 11 of season 2. We're going to have a chat around Microsoft Purview, a unified data governance service that helps you to manage and govern your on-premise, multi-cloud and software as a service data. Hey Alan, how's it going?
Hey Sam, I'm not doing too bad. How are you?
Yeah, really good, thank you. Really good. Been up to much? Anything exciting happening recently?
No, just working hard.
Are you preparing for the end of to Mod North to take over from basic authentication soon? Maybe we should do a public service announcement for anybody listening around that.
Yeah, getting prepared for Microsoft to turn off all of the legacy authentication on Exchange or Office 365 in general, because yeah, it's going off next month. Well, potentially next month, or worst case, end of December.
Didn't you say to me that they first announced it 3 years ago? Was it that it first was talked about, or something like that?
Yep, September 2019. They first did it, and then I think they gave everyone a year, and then COVID happened, and then they were like, okay, it's cool, we'll give you another year, and then something else happened, or COVID continued, and then yeah, now well, the deadline's been set. It hasn't changed yet, so let's hope it actually goes.
So yeah, folks, if you're still losing legacy authentication, make sure you check that out and make sure you're ready for the great switch off. Okay, back on track. Microsoft Purview. Alan, do you know much about Purview? Had any dealings with it in the past?
I've used some of the Purview products. Didn't used to be called Purview, um, yeah, but yeah, what from a high level, then what is Microsoft Purview?
Okay, so I'm just gonna sort of start now and just explain that we're going to be talking around the governance portal, which used to be called Azure Purview. So, if you don't know, and Alan, you might be able to summarize this a bit better and keep me on, keep me in line if I'm mistaken. Essentially, Purview has been used as a bucket now for all of the compliance tooling to be put into one place. So you have Purview as sort of the same as Entra is now a sort of a bucket for identity. Purview is a bucket for compliance. Now the governance portal is just one part of that, and confusingly, it used to be called Azure Purview, which doesn't make things particularly easy to explain. Alan, what are the other elements of the Purview sort of area that isn't covered by the governance portal?
So it will be the majority of stuff in the compliance.microsoft.com portal. But that kind of went around information protection, compliance manager, uh, communication compliance, and then your let me think about it now. It's the insider risk management, things like that. So it's all anything in there. There's quite a few more pieces to it. 'Cause there's a few things that are called privy as well in that portal. But yes, in effect, it's all been rebranded from things like Microsoft Information Protection going to Purview Information Protection.
Yeah, so the governance portal is the sort of so let me just explain what the data governance portal is trying to do. So what effectively what we're attempting to do is to manage and govern the data inside of your organization, not just inside of your organization, but also your multi-cloud data. So data that is in like your actual cloud platforms, and also software and a service data if possible. So one big thing to explain here really is that we're attempting to create a map of your data, um, and that isn't the actual data itself. It's the structure and the metadata of the data that you're storing itself. So if you imagine that your data estate was two, let's say two SQL Server tables, um, we would map each of those tables into our data map, understand the columns of data that are in those that data map, and then assign terms and classification to that data so we can understand what is being stored there. Because if you can imagine in large organizations, understanding where, say, all of your PII data is located, who owns that data, who manages it, and where it's actually being stored, can become a very complex problem to have to deal with, especially when you're talking, maybe you've got a very simple, like, data estate that, like, everything's in SharePoint. You might be able to, and you're a relatively small company, you might be able to understand, where all of your data is. But then when you start to bring in, cloud services like storage buckets, Azure SQL, data lakes, and everything in between, S3 buckets, X, Y, and Z, understanding what is being stored in those systems can become very complex to manage. Then you've also got SaaS applications as well. Maybe you've got a HR system, maybe you've got a Workday or a Dynamics talent, whatever your HR solution is. um, you might have data stored there that needs to be managed and governed, to understand, what you who organizes and manages that data. So it's really about building a data map of all your data, identifying your sensitive data classifications. So you're looking for, not just sort of intellectual property, but PII information, sensitive information inside of your business. A lot would argue that all data is relatively sensitive inside of an organization. It's relatively, it's usually only stored if it's got some sort of value and inherent sensitivity. And then what it's also um, uh, attempting to show you as well is an end-to-end data lineage, and that is essentially how data might pass through your organization. So it might start off with, as some bit of raw information. It may then be processed and then put into another format. So the example that we used in our training session was a data factory, showing how data is ingested and then processed and output into a different place. Um, Purview can actually show us how that data moves through the system.
So, so could this be used then to identify sensitive data, PII data where it shouldn't be? So you talked about SaaS applications. You may deem a SaaS application okay to process PII data within your organization, and maybe another one that you don't, that is capable of connecting to this solution. So you'll be able to see potentially data going into somewhere where you don't have the controls you need, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you the and I suppose I have to add context to my my understanding of Purview, right? So before, I essentially attended a Microsoft run event, a train the trainer event, and effectively that is to upskill people inside organizations to be able to then go and talk about Purview, the values and the value that it gives, and also have some sort of level of sort of boots on the ground experience of using it, because throughout this day that I spent with Microsoft, um, we actually did labs and we actually built our own Purview instances, and went through it. So I don't have an extensive background in compliance and governance. What the reasoning for me to go through it was to because you have your um, data, data governance officers. So you've got your CISOs and your compliance teams and people like that are trying to classify this data. But then you have an inherent sort of technical requirement as well to map this data. Because somebody has to be able to do the connections, configure Purview and get the data map to a place where you can start actually getting insights from it. So we really see that there's two roles there. There's a technical role and more of a cyber advisory sort of side of things. So I'm coming at it from the pure technical perspective, getting Purview configured, getting the data map built, adding the metadata to the data map, doing some scanning, and getting classifications and terms built into it. Not necessarily, the business side of understanding that data and risk classifying it and things like that from the cyber advisory side. And what we thought it might be a good thing to do, and this is a bit different from our normal episodes, was to go through in high level what I did on that train the trainer day, and just talk around um, the different areas that I configured, and sort of the value and the reasoning for doing that. It's not going to be too interactive because obviously we're on a podcast and I can only describe what I went through. But it might be good for me to sort of under to explain to you the different areas of Purview, what they're attempting to achieve, and how they do that in a really sort of a quick and concise way. Um, and this the Purview workshop and the Train the Trainer event, the actual follow along instructions are all based on GitHub, which we'll include a link to with the show notes, so that you can go ahead and build your own lab environment as well. We'll also quickly touch on costings and licensing, because that is a large part of Purview and it can be quite restrictive. So we will go through that as well. Right. So to start off with, then, Alan, have you got any other questions or anything you think I should cover during this?
No, I think you kind of covered the two aspects. I was going to bring it up later, maybe, but around there's the technical implementation piece, but then there's that kind of like cyber advisory or maybe data analyst kind of piece around how to deal with the data itself and build maybe build those maps and stuff. From my light view of or insight of Purview governance portal.
Okay, cool. Let's jump in. And Alan, also I'm going through. If you've got any questions, please do just jump in and interrupt me, because it is going to be very me talking heavy these sections. So yeah, let's start. So we started off the day creating our lab environments. Microsoft were very generous to give us an Azure pass to create our lab environments, which was good, because not only did we need Purview in the data governance portal, we needed some resources and some data to actually scan against, right? Because in a normal organization, you would have your buckets of data around your organization ready to go, but obviously for this lab environment, we didn't have any of that to go with. So we had sort of a quick start template, which brought us in a data factory, some virtual machines, a Synapse workspace, and I'll talk briefly at the end around Synapse, because we did go into that product a little bit, which is again something that I've got to go another Train the Trainer event to have a look at Synapse, but they do integrate. And also some storage accounts around, and one of them was converted to a data lake as well, for storage. So we had a quick start template. If you do go ahead and build this lab environment on GitHub, there is a quick deploy to Azure button. You've just got to ensure that you've created the resource providers. They gave us those warnings because on our Azure passes, they weren't enabled by default. So if you've got a free trial license, you might not have some of them ready to go. Then we moved on to actually creating the Purview account itself. This is effectively another resource inside of Azure, a Purview account resource. So it's relatively simple to create it. It's just sort of a name for the Purview account. You give it a location, And then there's also a managed resource group as well that it creates for its own resources that it needs under the hood. Um, because I think it's also good to understand that, just whilst I'm thinking about it, is that the Purview Data Governance Portal runs on top of an open source piece of software called Apache Atlas. So Apache Atlas is the underlying data map, sort of. That's going to build your data map and your glossaries and your things like that. And what Purview is on top of that is a sort of a a nice management interface and more value adds that they're going to add, like insights and things like that. Um, so so it's going to create some managed resources under the hood. I will talk briefly later on about REST APIs because it is good to understand that their REST APIs are open because they're based on open source software. Um, you deploy that, and then once you've got that, I'm going to just describe some of um, the main sort of areas of Purview, right? So you have a thing called the data map, and the data map is 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 effectively, as it sort of says, a map of all of your data sources and how they link together. So if you're from, say, a database background, and you've worked with databases with relationships, connecting each other, or if you've done that in Dataverse or something like that, you essentially have collections of data that is sourced from different data sources, and you link them together with relationships. So parent and child relationships to then build sort of a data map up across your whole data estate. And then when you're building these collections, right? So you build the collections of data. The collections are like buckets of different data sources, if that makes sense. So you might have a collection for, say, I don't know, like maybe you've got like you've got some on-prem data that you've got somewhere. You might build a collection of those that class, or those sort of areas of data. Then you can assign people to those collections. So you can say that, like Alan owns. So we've got a bunch of PII data that we store internally, and Alan is 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 the data curator for that. So it's Alan's responsibility to curate the data that is there, to understand what the data is, its life cycle, and how it works through the business. Then you can also, connect different levels of people. So you can say, like, who are the data source admins? So you can say, right, well, who's actually managing like the connections to that data and the access to that data and things like that. So it's not just a case of registering your data in, but it's also assigning people to that, just assigning people and their roles into that data, so that if you are searching through, if you are looking through your company's data, the catalog of data that you've got, you can understand who owns what and who's got responsibility for each of your buckets of data inside of your organization. And again, we're not actually looking at the data itself at this point. We're simply talking about the hierarchy and the map of the data inside of your business. And I suppose the first sort of thing to that you've got to do in order to start to understand the data in your organization is to register a data connector. So there's absolutely tons of data connectors, and more are being built absolutely rapidly for Purview. So things like storage accounts, on-prem SQL servers, Azure SQL, I assume Cosmos DB. I can't remember an icon for that, but I'm guessing so. Storage accounts, data lakes, S3 buckets, Postgres databases. If it stores data, you can probably bet that there's a connector for it. So if you're we our we had a data lake that was deployed as part of our lab environment that didn't have any data in it. So they got us to upload, I believe, some coronavirus stat data to go into it, just as some sort of open source data to go into there. And then from that, we added it to a collection inside of Purview. Once the data connector is in place, and if it's a if, like, for instance, you put in the storage account credentials that you're going to connect to that storage account, and then you can run a scan on that data, and that scan is going to go and find all of the metadata about that data that you've connected into it. So if you had connected a SQL, let's say just a single SQL table, it will go and pull the columns and the data formats for each of those columns for that SQL table. So again, it's not going to go in at this stage and actually, it's not going to go in at this stage and actually pull in any of the actual data itself. It's just looking at metadata for the structure for you to then classify. We and you can set up automated scanning that goes on over and over again to update these data sources as potential new information is uploaded. Because you can imagine, if you were going to connect to a sort of a non-structured data store like a data lake or a storage account, you could theoretically, like, upload any, like, JSON files at any time, that you might need to then reclassify and add context to in the future. It will go off and discover assets inside of the data connector that you've created. So, for instance, in our data lake, it went and basically found the two JSON files that we had in there, um, and effectively that was the first part of just getting that metadata for those for that data lake storage account actually in. The out of the box connectors are just sort of click, provide credentials, click click. There is actually a managed identity that you can assign to it so that it can actually do the authentication through, basically, at that point. So you can sort of give Purview the roles on inside of Azure. You can give it the roles directly. And so I think it's also important that it, as we've mentioned before, that it's not just Azure, and it's not just sort of Azure based or even cloud based resources. There are connectors for things like HR systems, CRM systems, things like that, third party SaaS applications, and also on prem connectors as well for your databases that are local to you, if that makes sense.
Okay, so it kind of sounds like the first part of even configuring, Purview. This part of Purview is to, in effect, identify your data sources, get them connected, identify who owns them and who is going to manage the connections to them, and put them into the groups, in effect, to specify who looks after the data, etc., and then start bringing that data in and then potentially starting to build that map. But
Yeah,
at this point, you're not bringing in any data; you're just getting metadata around what might be in there, or the tables and things like that.
that's correct. Yes, exactly. And I think what is when we were going through this, I was sort of thinking from a consultant's point of view, like how would you go through this process with a customer,
Mm.
right? Because uh, the way that I see this, and I'm relatively new to this and relatively naive, but I would assume that a lot of work is going to go into the discovery of the data in an organization when you go in there, right? You might have some customers that completely know, like, where every single ounce of data is in their data estate, and where things live, and what's the information that they're storing is, or the data that they're storing. Um, but my assumption is that you're going to have to go through a process with a customer to find all of those collections of data and all of those data sources, and then to map all of those people out. Maybe, I mean, you could just do it in Purview because you could create the collections ahead of the data sources, right? So you create the buckets of data first, where are, and the relationships between the collections. So you do have an area to sort of design out your data map before you even start registering sources, if that makes sense. um and just to follow on from that, there were two sides of registering data sources. There was a data lake connector and then an Azure SQL, or a SQL server, I can't remember, I think it was an Azure SQL connector as well. We effectively didn't have enough time on the day to do both because we overran a few things, going through a few different things. So, but on the SQL connector, you essentially connect to the SQL box, and then what it will do is it will show you all of the tables, and then you can decide which tables you actually want to bring in through that connector. So one connector can actually connect to like multiple tables inside of a SQL database at a time. I believe if you had multiple databases, you would have a separate connector per database, but don't quote me on that because I didn't actually go through that part of it. So once you've got to moving on to sort of search and browse. Once sources have been registered and you've done your initial scan, you'll start to get data inside of your data catalog, right? And this is really where it will start to show representation of real world objects that have, so for instance, like a table in Azure SQL or a Power BI report. Um, and then showing these assets in Purview, um, it helps it's the first stage of helping people to find data within the organization, right? Because if people are because if there is no control or governance of the data, then people aren't going to know where to look for different data sources, or what there is, and understanding it. And Alan will probably agree with me when I say visibility of most things when it comes to governance and security is one of the hardest things for an organization, right, Alan?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking of previous lives and just spinning up a new system and just going, yeah, I'll just chuck the SQL box on the same one, and then the database guy going, no, 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 you need to put it on a cluster, that sort of stuff. Why is there like 12 different SQL Expresses here? you know,
Yeah, exactly. And if those conversations are happening just internally with those technical teams, who's governing that data? Who even understands what those
exactly, yeah.
boxes are actually, storing, and the risks associated with that. So now, in order to search and browse, we are now going to go and add technical metadata, by adding definitions and classifications to the actual to the data attributes themselves. So such as the tables themselves and the columns of data, if you were doing a SQL database. So effectively, what we did is we selected. I'll use. I'm going to use the example of SQL tables because they're quite easy to understand because effectively they're like a big Excel spreadsheet in effect, right? So what you first do is you can name the actual say table itself or the entity itself, and you can give it description. So you can say, in this table, I store X, Y, and Z data. And maybe you might want to give a justification of why we store that data, right? Because if you're the owner of that data, you should be responsible and give justification as to why that data even needs to exist, right? Because if the data's got no value, then there's probably no point in actually even storing it. So you can give a description to the data. Then you can give it a classification, right? And Microsoft have a bunch of built-in classifications. So you are manually classifying this data, right? So in our scenario, we we had a list of like data per state, right? And they and basically we used the inbuilt classification of world cities, so we could actually understand what was in that, like blob of data. Sorry, I'm absolutely messing up the explanations because it's hard for me just to not visually show you through like the UI. But effectively, you're applying a classification to that data, of what's in that data. Then what it'll do is it will show you the schema of the data. So if you've ever worked with SQL before, you will have, for each of your tables you have a schema, and that effectively tells you what columns you have in that table. So you might have like an ID, you might have somebody's name, which is a string, you might have somebody's surname, which is another string, you might have their email address. If we're talking about PIO information, and what you're then doing is it'll give you the schema because it scanned it from the connector. It will tell you what the data types are, and then allow you to describe what you are actually storing in each of those, columns. So you can say, right, we are storing users' email addresses. Why are we storing that? Because we need it for login. Or we're storing their first name because we send them emails and we want them to be personalized, right? So it's just understanding what, because you could have a column named, first name, or it could be called F name, or it could be called name, or it could be called FN or N. Like it it could be hard to actually classify it from the metadata itself. And then what you can then do is then you can you can create contacts, for that, um, for that object of data. So in this example, a table in SQL. So you can say um, who the experts are. So like who are the people that are maybe on the ground looking after this data? Whose role and responsibility on a day-to-day basis is it to curate and understand this data? And then you've also got owners that you can assign to it as well. So you might say like, your head of, I don't know, let's say you had a table with all your HR information in it. Your owner might be your HR director, your head of HR, or one of your HR leads, because ultimately it's their responsibility to manage, you know, the life cycle of the data and whether it's actually relevant or not for the business. And then effectively there is ways to bulk edit this data as well. So if you were to import a bunch of tables and you didn't want to have to go through like every single table setting the owners and things like that, Purview does have some shortcuts in to be able to actually edit this stuff, relatively quickly.
Okay, so next stage then of getting the data in and getting some metadata is then to kind of, I guess, document the environment, or give you the opportunity to, where it, rather than it being in separate documents because it's different products, SaaS applications, etc. It's everywhere. You can in effect have one place to say, this is the table, this is what it's, why we store it, etc. This column, we store this data because of X, Y, Z, and as you said, you've got owners of the overall data and also the experts of the actual data.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. So effectively, we are saying that, um, we're we're adding that layer of context onto the metadata that we've collected, so that in the future, and from what I can see, it is all manual at the moment, right? We are not doing any automatic classification or anything like that. We are effectively at this point just manually labeling up, data sources and data tables, that are in the business. Okay, so the next part to go through is the glossary. So it the glossary is around adding further domain knowledge and context, and effectively tagging, data inside of your organization. And the complex part of me explaining glossary to you is is it's kind of very subjective to your organization's data. I'll use a very simple example for you. So if you think about it, you could have hierarchies of business terms. So, for instance, you could tag different sets of data for, say, different business domains in your organization. So, for instance, like finance, marketing, sales, and HR. So, you could create terms and link data sources, well, data assets in your organization to different business domains inside of your organization, which would then, because what you might have is you might have like disparate data sets for one business area. So your HR finance data, a bit of the finance data might be in the HR system. It might be in some custom reporting and Azure Data Factory work that you've got, and then inside of you know Power BI, you might have some other data, or about finance. So finance data could be spread around your organization, but you might not be able to organize your finance data in collections, if that makes sense, because your collections might be looking at different actual applications that you've got in your business. um and what you can also do is, and this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated for me and my small brain, is glossary terms can also have relations to other glossary terms. So you could have like finance, team one, team two, team three. So you might have finance, invoicing, credit control, um, whatever the different like areas. Sorry, I'm not very good with finance. I should be. My wife's an accountant, but all the different areas of finance, and you might want to break that term down even further to get more granularity, right? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to layer on a representation of the real world onto our data map so that we can query it in the future. So if we want to filter all of our insights and analytics on finance data, we'll use these terms. We'll use these terms to do that in the future. So they took us through creating a parent term, which they used Contoso for that, which effectively would be like your company's parent term, right? And I think that's effectively just a root like term for your organization, kind of like root management group sort of thing. Like that's how I sort of saw it in
I,
my
I
in my
I guess
in my
that could
brain.
be used if you had if you're dealing with partners or mergers, acquisitions, etc., where you could have it at the top layer sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and in your purview might sit in your parent company tenant or something like that, and have connections into others, right? So yeah, 100%. And then underneath that, they effectively got us to create another term that was linked to a business unit. So they created a business unit template, which was like sales, marketing, finance, human resources, and IT. And we connected that in. They also showed us bulk importation of terms as well. So I believe, and I'm not a cyber advisory expert whatsoever, but they were explaining how some companies already have their terms mapped out that you can effectively import via CSV into the system. Terms can also um, terms can also have a status, whether they're draft or approval. So as you're adding new terms into the system, you have the ability to, draft them out and then make them approved in the future. You can also export them. So if you want to export them, update them, and import them back in, I believe that's also possible to do. But we didn't actually go through that. Then they walked us through actually assigning a term to an actual asset itself. So we assigned it to an actual. We actually assigned it to a like a JSON file in a data lake, and effectively it showed um, effectively it showed us, it showed like a tag on the data asset itself once it had been assigned. Um, then they also showed us accessing different data via those terms effectively. So you would access a term and then you would click on it to view the different data sources that you've got. So you've got a different way of querying through um, your data set. So yeah, so it's hard. It is quite complicated for me to really explain the glossary without you actually going through the system yourself, because when you do it, I think it'll make a lot more logical sense. I effectively saw it as parent-child tagging in my simplistic, brain, but it could well be something different. So the next session that we did, it's quite a long day. We had quite a few modules that we went through, and we had lots of things to do. And we've got classifications that we then talked through. And classifications are effectively tags of what the actual data that is being stored. We talked about classifications. Um, um, we talked about classifications, sort of earlier. But this is where um, automated classification rules can be actually put in. And I believe what it's doing is running these classification rules actually on the data itself when it does those scans, right? So kind of like DLP, like classification rules, like this the same. I believe the same. No, not is it DLP? Yeah, it is DLP classification rules. That's right. No, sensitivity labels and the rules that come in from that side, I believe, are also duplicated over this side as well. I can remember them. Sorry, I just pulling something out of the back
Yeah,
of
you
my
can
brain from the
synchronize
day.
them in, can't you?
You can synchronize them in. Yes, you can, and you can create your own as well, which is good. So you can create your own regular expressions to effectively find different things. So they use the example of Twitter handles to add a custom um, classifier in, and what that'll effectively do is it will go and look for different values inside of your data and classify them automatically. They took us through that, adding a data set, a Twitter handle data set into our data lake, and then running the scan again for it to automatically tag as um, as Twitter handles. So this is actually going. These classifications are actually going into the data, running. Um, Microsoft's own internal classifications, and also being able to run your own classifications as well and develop them.
Yes, that's the sensitive information types.
That's it. Yeah, sorry, I can never remember like where it actually sits, but when we were on the call, somebody specifically asked that question because it was they looked very similar. Like the list was incredibly similar, and the person that was running the session basically they I don't think they actually 100% knew, but they thought they were the same the same one brought in. I don't know. I could have remembered that part incorrectly. Does that make sense so far, Alan? Um, about what we've gone through there.
Yeah, I think it makes sense that you're potentially creating rules using those sensitive information types to, in effect, classify your data. If I guess if you don't, maybe there is a change in a data type, maybe, or a new tables or columns added to a piece of information, that it will hopefully classify or at least alert on classifying it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And what we're effectively doing is we're effectively hunting for data in our estate at that point as well, right? And trying to understand what is there, maybe without having to go through it line by line.
Well, exactly. Just quickly, that you may think that is what the data is in there, and
Correct.
then you find out that there's more in there than you were bargained for.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. The next area that they took us through was lineage, and lineage is effectively how data moves through your organization. Um, we use the example of a data factory running an extract, transform, and load ETL process. And what is nice inside of, and this is where the sort of first party integrations are really nice, because if you did happen to have an ETL process that was run in, say, Data Factory, you can actually see the steps that it takes inside of Data Factory and how the data moves through the system and where it ends up afterwards. Um, we we went through it. They gave us the 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 data factory sort of out of the box, and data factory isn't an area that I know particularly well. I haven't actually built up anything in there for quite some time. But the what was really good was the visual representation it gave at the end. It showed like the two data lake assets that it was pulling from. It gave a description of what it was doing and then a link to actually open it in Data Factory so you could get there quickly to actually go and inspect the steps of what it was doing, and then showing where the data went out afterwards as well. So that Data Factory itself actually comes up as an actual asset inside of the data catalog, so you can actually see it as a like an object, so you can like track what it's doing inside of your organization. What's great then is because if you're looking at, say, the output side of that ETL, like it's like a couple of things go in, it does something, and something pops out on the other side. You've then got context of where that data actually came from and what systems are actually being used to generate that data. So again, as a common theme with everything, it's discovery, it's describing what is there, it is making sure that the business understands the data that it has and how data moves through the organization.
Yeah, makes sense.
So you've been through all that hard work, right? You've found all your assets. You've done your metadata tagging. You've understood who your owners are. You've created terms for your data, a glossary of terms for your data to describe what your data looks like. You've then classified the data to understand what the data actually is. What are you storing? And you've also hopefully built some of your own custom classifiers. Maybe you've got your own record IDs or customer IDs or something like that you want to track. Then comes on to insights, and the way that I saw insights was like, in my mind, it was like Power BI for your for your purview, basically. Um, you can look through your total data estate to understand what data has been curated to start off with. So what has been classified, what's not been classified, how many assets have currently got coverage, and what's not got coverage. Because you could just connect everything in, not build any terms, not build any classifications, don't assign it to any owners or anything, and then you could basically show like where you are on that transformation journey to get it there. And then you can obviously and part of that is showing who the owner is and whatnot, and it will give you health about different collections inside of your organization. So inside of a collection, which is essentially a bucket of assets and connectors, you'll be able to see what assets you've got, what's been classified, what's not been classified, so you can break down those numbers for you as well. It's obviously going to, over time, because this is going to go back and repeatedly scan those data sources. So if you've got yourself a SQL database, and then you let's say you add a couple of extra tables to that, it will go and pick up those tables in your data sources, and then it will say, okay, well, I've got some new data now that's not been classified, it's not being controlled. go ahead and get started on that work. So it's really going to give you sort of operational insights around, building of your data map and catalog, and understanding how all of that works. Then you can so that's really from the first part is from a data stewardship point of view. So like who owns what and how things are sort of looking from a people perspective. And the second side of it is an asset perspective. So, what sort of assets have you got in your organization? These are our data lakes, these are our SQL servers, these are our X, Y, and Zs. And you can see it from that side. So, how many data sources you have, how much data is in them, and how they track over time, the file types and extensions of stuff that maybe your blobs that you're storing, and your text based files. Then the next part is to look at it from the sort of viewpoint of the glossary. So this is really why we are, going through the work of building that glossary, because what we're then doing is we are being able to slice through and understand the data from a terms perspective. So how many terms there are, how many terms have say been approved, but they've got no assets listed to them yet. Like, we approved this term to be added into our glossary, but we didn't bother to connect any assets to it. So why have we got that glossary of information? If that makes sense, right? We're saying we're storing, you know, this information, but we're not actually linking it to any data in our data map. And then you can do it from the classification view. So you can look at, how many files have been classified, what their classifications are, what's your, if you've got like a classification category of like personal PII information, how much is there, how it's growing over time, and things like that. So you can really get, information onto that. Then you've got the sensitivity labels as well. So a viewpoint of that, like we've talked about, automated sensitivity labeling as well. So that's also going to bring in, that's going to be really important to understand how much of those sensitivity labels are being detected, and what you've got inside of your organization.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds very good. So you can get an idea. Again, that's probably helping you see, well, one, where your data is, and also, like you said, it's as the data changes, you're seeing that view of it, and that you can decide, where you need to make changes, or potentially there is misconfiguration, as you said, around the glossary terms
Yes.
that you've created them because it makes sense to, but you've not actually got anything that uses it. And
Yeah.
is that a problem, or is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, might
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. And I think those insights are going to give you control over what's happening over time. Like what's the new sensitive information types that are entering my business over time, and trying to understand that. Then just moving on from there, we have a very quick sort of overview of monitoring. Essentially, it's the diagnostic logs. You can send them to wherever you'd like, to track sort of the scan activity, and things like that. So it's sort of the health of Purview to understand if it's actually running, and it's operating in the correct way. Um, we didn't really go over that too much, to be totally honest with you. It was more of a, we configured it, and just saw the output from it. Now this is the bit that I've really not got a huge technical area in, so I'm going to go over it relatively quickly. But I did want to include it because if you are using Azure Synapse, it does allow you to do an integration into Azure Synapse. I'm not going to describe it in too much detail, because honestly, I we did it for like 5 minutes, so I can't really show you that here. But the I believe I'm not going to make a recommendation as into the feature benefits of doing it, because I can't understand it from the Synapse perspective, right? So I'm not going to attempt to. But take it from me and from Microsoft, there's a first party integration into Synapse. I'm not going to try and butcher this area of this area of the product. Um, so that's basically through the main set of modules that we did. Um, the it has now been extended, um, with some optional learning modules that we didn't get to do. Basically, what I've just described in 55 minutes on. We've got to wrap up soon now,
Yeah.
but we effectively did over a day, because we were building the labs. It was actually really interesting to go through the product, because there's a lot there. It's a bit of a beast to get your head around, and I don't proclaim to be an expert in this whatsoever. But one big part that they did really touch on and they wanted to talk about is the REST API. So so effectively, you can you can effectively do, um, the vast majority of things that you can do from the UI, you can do through the API. That's effectively what um, they were doing, and the building of the catalog is really important. So what they wanted to get across was that it was exposing the out of the box, Apache Atlas API as well. So if you are an organization that is already using Apache Atlas in your workflow, and a move to Purview is something that you're thinking about, and maybe you have, and I think this is more for sort of advanced data governance scenarios. I could be wrong on that. But you could reuse your existing connections straight into Purview, because essentially under the hood it is running Apache Atlas. That's pretty much it, and I have flown over a very large product in Purview very quickly. Is there anything, Alan, that you want to anything sort of areas that you want me to try and answer or clarify for you?
Well, I think you've done a very good job of getting a day's worth of training into just under an hour, um, into this podcast, and and even so, that was quite, I guess, high level as well. Really going through it, so well done. Um, but one part, I guess, everyone's probably going to be asking is, as always, how much does it cost? What licenses do I need?
So it's quite interesting around pricing for the data governance portal, and I think I think it comes down to the actual resources and requirements that are required to run this, to do the scanning, um, because effectively the main cost is in, um, effectively running the workers that run the scanners. You can scale them from a minimum, I think, of like one virtual core. I think it is something like that. But effectively, you're looking at, from a even the most simplistic implementation is going to cost you £300 a month minimum to £400 a month minimum, right? Because you can scale those workers down to, like, I think it's like one unit, one capacity unit, I think they call it. Um, but you can't get it any lower than that. I am just going to bring up the Azure. I just want to make sure I'm just, data governance pricing. I just want to get the terminology just correct for you, because I just want to make sure that I'm not
So,
absolutely.
yeah, so whilst you're doing that, I think as well, because I've kind of a little bit, but I think the idea is you've got to understand how often you need to scan the different data sets, isn't it? How often you need to versus cost at some point. You may not want to scan every hour. Some stuff you might need to, some of it you might need to be like once a week or once a day kind of thing to reduce that or optimize that cost, I guess.
Yeah, the part that costs the money is the elastic data map, right? And you have to have at least one capacity unit running at any time to support that. And one capacity unit per hour costs 34p in UK money. So that is a base cost of just rough maths in GBP for 732 hours average month of £254 just to run that part of it. And you have to have that active. Now, that can scale. Um, that that can scale up to any what's the highest one? Like effectively any number of capacity units, and that's effectively what they were saying, is like you can control your costs by limiting the amount of maximum capacity units. And then we were discussing that, well, you've got to be a certain sort of organization that can absorb a 200, and it's not £254 a month, because you've got other things to go on top of that. So for instance, like you've got data map population and things like that. There's data map enrichment as well. So like you said, all of these scanning jobs and jobs that need to run over time. So you've got to you've got to absolutely layer that on top. So I would also just be cognizant of actually putting this in, even inside your organization, and your in or a customer. You are going to have not just the cost of populating it, managing it, and getting value from it, but the underlying cost is there. What is great, it's all cloud based. There's pretty much no management of the underlying application or infrastructure. You don't have to bring up an Apache Atlas installation yourself. That isn't free to do that, if you see what I mean. The part that's complex, which I still haven't worked out, is if you've got MSDN credits or something like that, you're not ever going to fit this inside of an MSDN credit for a lab environment, and that's what's been quite restrictive for us in order to get a lab environment up and running, because um, having a 250 to 350 or £400 a month bill to set up a lab environment is an awkward conversation to have, when it's coming out at 5,000, say £5,000 £5,000 a year. So, but I do definitely see, from my perspective, I do see the value that building a data map could add to an organization. To add and to govern and control data, and to give you more visibility of it. And again, I just have to preface, I'm not a Purview expert whatsoever, or a compliance expert, but I think it's good to understand, what challenges businesses are facing in this area, and what they're trying to do to resolve it.
Yeah, I guess you got to understand of, this system's doing it for you. There's a lot of, there is a lot of automation. There's a lot of easy mapping perspective. I mean, imagine trying to do this manually against all those data sets and writing the documentation, or making sure people, staff are using the right glossary terms and things like that. You're not going to see any of that. And, having to do a report, if you need to do a report once a year, or however you want to see that data, it's just going to be
Yeah. Yeah, and
insane.
I haven't actually talked about it, but there is a full like RBAC, role based, control system. So you are just paying for the instance itself, not per user as well, right? Because you could, because if you had 10 users using it, it's you could theoretically say, well, it's £40 a month per user. And you might think, actually, for my data governance team, if I got a 10 strong data governance team to run this, you know that sounds pretty reasonable to me at that point, doesn't it? It's just hard to start, I think, is the and the concern around it is £400 to start, not as a cap. So dependent on the size of your data estate, you may need to adjust those things as well. Okay, let's wrap up. I think everybody will be ready to finish on Purview now. But if you've enjoyed this episode, please do consider subscribing if you'd like to listen to more of this sort of content in the future. We have many topics that we'd like to cover, and your listens and support is what will continue to fuel the podcast going forward.
We also have the ability to give feedback. So if there's a bit more of this that you want Sam to dive into, whether he wants to or not, might be a question. But send us some feedback. There should be a link in the show notes to, in effect, do that, and then we can see it and we can. It's good. Good or bad. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We're here to talk about topics that people want to listen to, right? We're not just we're not spending time talking to each other because because we want to, so yeah, it's all driven from what everybody wants to listen to. So Alan, next episode, I think this one's for you. So what are you going to be talking about?
Well, you did say people were going to be bored of Purview, but I'm going to talk about Microsoft Purview information protection. So classifying data from the compliance center side thing, Office 365, things like that, and kind of probably explain it a bit so that it kind of ties into what you've been talking about as well. But yeah, should be good.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yep. Thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. Speak to you soon. Bye.